Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being, Totality and Infinity. Okay, section 4. So we're finishing up section 4 today, Beyond the Face, looking at D, E, F, and G, those subsections, subjectivity and Eros, Transcendence and fecundity, Filiality and fraternity, and the infinity of time. So those are the 4 subsections we're going to look at, and conveniently, that's how I've broken the video up. So let's look at the first part there, section D, subjectivity and Eros. Okay, so the idea with this section, the main idea, Levinas is just looking at how subjectivity is transformed in voluptuosity, in this relationship of Eros. What happens to subjectivity? So originally we saw that subjectivity was the virile and heroic I. That's a direct quote, which puts an end to the anonymity of the there is. So this is that was that first stage we looked at in the book, that where the I was that separated being. We also called it atheism. So completely separated in happiness or enjoyment, completely whole in and of itself, so not lacking anything, completely separated though, but not lacking anything, not missing anything in order that it could take on in order to be complete. The virile and heroic I. Then in voluptuosity, so this is the encounter with the feminine, the subject owes his identity not to his initiative of power, but to the passivity of the love received, in which he finds himself again as the self of another, and not only as the self of himself. So in this case, so when we're skipping over the, or I guess, so this isn't the other in terms of the face-to-face, right? Just remember that. We're looking at Eros, so we're looking at that relation with the feminine, sexuality. This is the love. This is the other as beloved, I guess would be one way to think of it. So we're skipping that, the face to face, the other encountered in discourse, and going to this encounter with the feminine, this encounter in love. So here, the I is no longer an I complete in and of itself, but now is related to this other being, the feminine. And that means that there's suddenly, instead of being pure activity, instead of being purely self-contained, the I is an element of passivity has entered here. I'm not just I on my own. Now I'm I in relation to this other, this beloved, the feminine. So there's a passivity enters into my identity. And in this, so that's kind of the main point from that little quote. So I discover myself not as self-enclosed, self-sufficient entity, but as this another half, if you like, another part of a relation which is bigger than me. So I don't possess my existence completely. Instead, I'm possessed by that existence. And there's a nice quote to capture this. Self-possession becomes incumbent with oneself. The subject is imposed upon itself, drags itself along like a possession. The freedom of the subject implies responsibility. The coinciding of freedom with responsibility constitutes the I, doubled with itself, encumbered with itself. So originally I was that I in self-possession, but now I'm not in complete control of myself. I'm not the only force here. Now I find that my possession doesn't entirely belong to me. now I find that I have to drag it with me. I have to carry it with me. I'm encumbered with myself. It's a nice way of putting that. So the freedom, my freedom now is not arbitrary, but there is responsibility now. Now I'm not arbitrarily free. I don't only have myself to consider. Now there is this other which conditions me in some way, which I'm even responsible for or responsible to. So in becoming truly free, in achieving this more genuine freedom, I'm no longer arbitrarily free, which I was before. And it's in that sense that I don't possess myself. Instead, there's this element of responsibility for or to the other, the beloved, comes about. And the final stage then of Eros is fecundity. And in this, I'm delivered from this encumberment by being carried beyond myself toward a future in which I will be myself, but in the other, my child. Which is to say, I can be produced as infinitely recommencing, as infinite. Okay, so a couple of things about that before we move on. So this final stage, fecundity. So we're following a progression here. I was originally purely self-contained, complete in what I was, arbitrarily free, but arbitrarily free. Then with the encounter with the feminine, voluptuosity, I discover that I'm no longer in control of myself. I'm no longer the sole master, if you like, of my existence. Now, my existence takes on meaning in this relation which is bigger than me, this relation with the beloved. And so my existence now I become somewhat passive in relation to my own existence. I don't own it completely. So I'm kind of, in a sense, as Levinas says, I'm encumbered with myself. I'm bringing myself along, carrying it with me. And the final stage, fecundity, I'm delivered from this encumberment. I no longer have to carry myself because because I'm moving towards a future in which I will be myself again totally, but in a transcendent sense. But I will have transcended the local self, I guess you could say, that I am. And I'll have transcended that self in my child, who is an other, but nevertheless still myself. And in that sense, I am produced as infinitely recommencing, as infinite. And that is if anything sums up Levinas's philosophy, I think it's that. The notion that the infinite can be concretely experienced, and that's it. The infinite can be concretely experienced. So when we saw that first through the face-to-face encounter, which brought us before infinity, not as an abstract concept, but as a concrete reality right in front of me, experienced in a genuine relationship through discourse. But that wasn't a transcendence. We never transcended ourselves. But with fecundity, that transcendence is complete. Now I don't only come face to face with the infinite. Now I partake in it. Now through my child, I'm able to become infinite. And like I say, that seems to me to be, if anything can summarize totality and infinity, I think it's that concept. All right, the second subsection here, subsection E, transcendence and fecundity. So we've kind of talked about this. I mean, really just revisiting ideas, fleshing them out in a little bit more detail, or looking at them from a different direction. Most of the stuff we've already covered. But yeah, I mean, that's not to say there's no value in looking at it again. I think that's kind of a hallmark of good philosophy, actually. So transcendence and fecundity, what does it mean? Well, we'll start with, Levinas starts by looking at how transcendence in philosophy usually fails. And there are two reasons he gives, and they're kind of opposite reasons. The first is by trying to understand transcendence in terms of being. So here, the self is absorbed into some kind of ultimate or absolute. And this is self-contradictory, because in such a movement where the subject, the individual subject, is subsumed into this greater totality, the subject is always lost in the movement of transcendence. It's always reduced to a part of this greater totality. So the subject never transcends because the subject disappears. And this is, I think, what Levinas has in mind here is the Hegelian type of absolute, or a Spinozan kind, or even a Kantian type of transcendental notion here, that these all fail for this reason, that the individual is lost along the way in the movement of transcendence. The other way that philosophy usually fails in terms of transcendence is through becoming. So if existence is centered on time, then transcendence occurs through the upsurge of, or the projection into, the future. That's how we see ourselves transcending ourselves, our present, by this movement into the future. That's what characterizes philosophies of becoming. So in this, the subject breaks from unity into possibility and multiplicity, right? A multiplicity of possible futures, right? But in so doing, the subject never escapes from him or herself. The projection is always towards my possibles. So there's never a transcendence. There is no transcending moment anymore. And that's the way that philosophies of becoming fail to achieve transcendence here. They fail to take us beyond ourselves, because in projecting towards the future, we are always projecting from ourselves. We never get beyond ourselves in any way. And so this would be phenomenology, especially, I guess, Heidegger, Sartre, those kinds of philosophies. Levinas, however, his notion of transcendence is different, because he includes a plurality not as a simple relation acting across a range of subjects, which would therefore place the plurality outside of the event of being. So he doesn't refer to a plurality that is a connection of a number of different individual existing subjects, which means that it's outside of those individual subjects. His plurality is in the existing of the existents themselves, in the existing of the existing objects themselves. That is to say, his plurality is in the event of being, in the event of the individual subject, him or herself. And how does this plurality arise within the event of being, within the individual themselves? Two ways we've looked at. Eros, so that immanence and transcendence, that kind of Eros is that relation on the border, on the limit of immanence and transcendence. and he says sexuality is the plurality of our existing. Although it's not a complete transcendence, it has that transcendent element. It always comes back to itself. So, and he says that, I think he says our love is always ultimately love of the love of oneself. So it's never a complete transcendence, but it's a transcendence. Maybe we could think of it maybe as a semi-transcendence that takes place within the event of being. It's a plurality arises within the existence within my existence, not outside me, but not purely referenced to me either, not purely a reference to myself. So there is this pseudo-transcendence, I guess, in Eros, in that relation with the feminine. But plurality comes in to Levinas's philosophy in another way, in a more profound way, a more permanent way, in fecundity, obviously. The relation with the stranger, who is other, while also at the same time being me. Nice. So let's have a look at the third part, filiality and fraternity. So filiality is basically the father-son relationship from the perspective of the son. So the son then is a created freedom, which means neither a break from and a new beginning, or a continuing. It's neither of those things. So it's not a rupture, because, so we'll just look at both of those. Levinas is claiming that the son is not a complete break, not a rupture from the father, but he's also saying that the son is not a direct continuation of the father. So let's just have a look at both of those. It's not a rupture. The son is not a rupture, because the son is without being on his own account. Without being on his own account. Let me give you a quote. The I owes its unicity as an I to the paternal Eros. The father does not simply cause the son. To be one's son means to be I in one's son, to be substantially in him, yet without being maintained there in identity. So I think there's obviously Levinas is trying to understand this from the perspective of his religion. There's a parallel here between God and Jesus, right? The Father and the Son, and the one of the less plausible dogmas of the church, that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all the same. The Trinity is all the same, while at the same time being somehow different. Levinas is trying to deal with that. And so that's kind of the background that this discussion is taking place on. Hence why, by the way, there's no reference to a maternal or a daughter. Levinas is operating within that kind of, within the strictures of his faith, which was obviously male-centric. So that's the background. Which means that we have to be a little bit careful with this, I suppose, because he's trying to push this idea through that the son is the father, while at the same time being separate. And I mean, it's a religious notion that he's really pushing, but you can kind of, I mean, there is, I think, this is valid. This is not a completely crazy notion that the son isn't merely caused by the father. The son isn't made the way that you might make something, make a model airplane or something, you know. It's not something completely separate from the creator. It's something that the Son, the Son has the Father within him, literally, in terms of biology, right, and DNA, and there is a truth to that. So it's a closer bond between the Father and the Son than it is between the artist and the work of art. There is a closer bond. The Son is without being on his own account. That there is this tight internal connection between the Father and the Son. The parent and the child would be the correct way to put it, but again, following Levinas is tied to his religion here, so it's Father and Son. So anyway, that's why he says the Son is not a rupture, it's not a complete break, but it's also not a direct continuity. The Son is not a direct continuity. The Son is ultimately a different person from the Father. The Son is ultimately an individual. He has his own character, his own personalities, his own likes and dislikes. He has his own separate life, right, from the Father. So it is the situation where there is this kind of ambiguity. A child is not a product made by an artist or an artisan, but at the same time it's not a direct continuation of the parent. So there is this ambiguity, I think. Not a continuity, not a rupture, not taking up the past as if for the first time. Rather, the Son is recapturing the past as a recourse through the Father. That's how Levinas puts that. So not a continuity, not a rupture, which means that if the Son is not a complete new beginning, he's not taking up the past as if for the first time. He's taking up a past, but a past that has already belongs to the Father. That the Son is not starting afresh. The Son is coming into the world with this past behind it already, which it's taking up. It's I guess it's culture, it's traditions, the history of the family name, what the family has been through, and the history of the family. The Son is taking all that up with it. So it's not a taking up of the past as if for the first time. It's a recapturing as a recourse through the Father. So I think that's kind of a good way to put it. Captures the ambiguity, I think, of the relation between the parent and the child. As long as we want to be clear that is quite different from the God-Jesus relation. But still, Levinas is drawing the parallel. He's trying to legitimize, I guess, would be maybe a cynical way of putting it, legitimize that the Judeo-Christian dogma of the Father and the Son. But he's not completely off. He's not completely off the mark with that. So filial obligations then, regarding that, since the Son owes his unicity to the Father, he can be brought up, be commanded, and can obey. That's kind of Levinas' take on filial obligations. And I guess he's fleshing out the one of those, is it the sixth commandment, honor thy father and mother. So filial duties are important, and Levinas is just weaving that into his philosophy. And the other thing that is worth mentioning here is fraternity, which we've talked about before. But just to remind you, although the Son is unique, He appears in the world amongst brothers, amongst equals, and not just among them, but in face of them, to serve them. And we talked about that earlier as well, but it's just nice to throw that in here, just as a reminder. And let's move into the last section, the infinity of time. So the infinity of time, obviously this is going to be connected with fecundity. The I can only participate in infinity through the other, and this is most completely, or maybe originally, in the multiplicity and discontinuity of fecundity. We've already talked about discontinuity, the importance of the other, the child being discontinuous from the father. Without that, then there's no transcendence. There's no sense. The infinite doesn't enter into the individual at all. So the discontinuity, though, since we've talked about that, there's a different aspect I wanted to focus on here, or Levinas wants to focus on. The discontinuity means that time pardons existence. So the idea here, I think, is that it's like we're given, although we've already established it's not a complete rupture, there is a sense of getting kind of a clean slate, maybe. It's not a completely new, it's not a break and a new start, but it's a sense of getting a fresh start, maybe. That's how Levinas describes this discontinuity in fecundity. So, pardon, though, implies fault. And I don't think Levinas spells this out in this section, which was kind of weird, I thought. But the way I see it, then, the only reason we would need to be the only reason our existence would need to be pardoned is one or maybe both of these. First, the permanent revolution of the Son from the Father. So the Son, in being born, is always like this attempt to be a complete individual, to stand alone, to stand independent of the Father. And this sense of a revolution, I'm pretty sure that's a quote, permanent revolution of the Son from the Father. That might require pardoning. The other thing, and I think this is probably more likely, is that what requires the pardon is being this separated atheism, the separated atheism of the I that we talked about at the beginning, where the I is fundamentally separated, is complete in and of itself, and we talked about that as enjoyment or happiness, enjoyment from, I think was the word we used, was it? This was a long time ago. And so that separation, Levinas also called it atheism, which suggests that there is something kind of wrong about it, or something, at least maybe something inauthentic or not genuine. So I think maybe that is what Levinas is getting at here, as requiring a pardon. And we've already talked about this separated I being guilty, and being redeemed in the face-to-face relation. So I think that's what he's getting at here, and this continuity that fecundity provides has this effect of pardoning that crime of existence, to exist as a separated I. But for Levinas, there is a paradoxical nature to pardon. And the paradox for him is one of retroactivity. How pardon is essentially the reversibility of time. Pardon refers to the instant elapsed in such a way that it is as though that instant had not passed on. Pardon acts upon the past, somehow repeats the event, purifying it. But in addition, forgetting nullifies the relations with the past, whereas pardon conserves the past pardoned in the purified present. The pardoned being is not the innocent being. So the paradox for Levinas here is how how pardon somehow brings the past back, recalls the past moment to purify it in the present, which is a moving, like you said, a reversibility of time, moving in the opposite direction. It calls up that past, and through the discontinuity of fecundity, purifies it, gives it a new pardoned beginning. However, just in line with that quote, pardon doesn't erase the past. It doesn't get rid of the past. So it's not the same as being innocent from the beginning. To be pardoned, to have your existence pardoned, is not the same as being innocent. You still did something wrong, but you've just had that kind of cleared. You've had that mistake purged from your record, as it were. Okay, nice. Anyway, so that's pardon. And he also talks about pardon and time a little bit more, and this is interesting. And I'll go through, and you can decide for yourself what you think of it. So he says, time is not a mathematical series of discrete instants. That's just basic phenomenology, right? We can't reduce time to a series of discrete instants. That's kind of the scientific approach to time. But Levinas also says time is not a continuous duration, and that's obviously a rejection of Bergson. So time then for Levinas requires a rupture of continuity and continuation across this rupture. So now we're no longer talking about fecundity specifically. We're talking more about the nature of time. So it's not a series of discrete instants, but it's not a continuous duration either. It requires a rupture of continuity and a continuation across that rupture. So it requires both discontinuous and the element of continuity. And this then is precisely what Levinas calls resurrection. Resurrection constitutes the principal event of time. In continuation, the instant meets its death and resuscitates. Death and resurrection constitute time. But such a formal structure presupposes the relation of the I with the other, and at its basis, fecundity across the discontinuous, which constitutes time. So, first of all, resurrection, what? Come on, Levinas. Okay, anyway, I'm going to defer my outrage at that for just a moment. Secondly, this is very Cartesian, right? This is pretty much straight out of Descartes. This is exactly how Descartes sees time, as a series of instants where each instant is kind of a death and is brought back to life in the next moment. And that the guarantor of all that for Descartes was God. But Levinas is making basically exactly the same idea here. Each instant dies, to continue the metaphor, and is resurrected in the next moment. And that's how he sees time. Which is really, okay, fair enough. So it's not actually a series of discrete instants. Yeah, he's throwing in this notion of resurrection, that each instant is being reborn. Maybe would be a less loaded word to use. Reappearing. So time then for Levinas is actually constituted by this death and resurrection. And so while that's time itself, that's the nature of time, that also that presupposes the other. It presupposes fecundity and the discontinuous and the pardon that comes with it. The pardon being that repeating of the past event, purifying it at the same time. There's that sense is kind of built into time itself. So we saw the child as a fresh start, as a pardoning of existence. And this is just kind of more fine-grained. Levinas is finding that same principle at work in the nature of time. Time itself is a pardoning of existence, with each moment experiencing that same discontinuity that we saw in fecundity. So each moment experiencing that same pardon, that same repeating the past event, but purifying it in this new present. Okay, so yeah, interesting way of thinking about time. Like I've said before with Levinas, I'm not sure that there's a really solid metaphysical account of time here. It still doesn't seem to get beyond really kind of a pseudo-poetic description of time. But yeah, I mean, it's there. It's an interesting way of thinking about it, and nothing more to say about it there. The last thing I want to focus on before we move into a summary is just all of these Judeo-Christian concepts and terms that Levinas has thrown at us in this chapter. So I promised a rant. I'll try not to go off the rails, but this definitely deserves a rant, I think. I've got 3 points I want to make. The first is that it kind of has the feel of something tacked on to his philosophy. Something that's not essential to his philosophy. It doesn't really... I mean, to talk about our relation, our love with the beloved as being feminine, it doesn't add anything to his philosophy at all, I think. And then to smuggle in this idea of the virgin, eternal feminine, it doesn't do anything. It just has the feel of like something he's wanting to bring his religion into his philosophy in some way. And the structure of the book bears that out too, because the whole book, right, we've gone through all of Levinas's philosophy, and then this last section, 30 pages out of whatever 200 and something, this small 30-page section, he suddenly just throws all of these terms at us, and it just has the feel of something inessential, but something that he felt like he had to do or he wanted to do, but something that he could have easily done without. And the way the book is structured, I think, indicates that. It shows that these are not serious parts of his philosophy. The second thing is that they ultimately make him sound as sexist as his faith is, right? Because, I mean, there's no getting around it. The Bible is pretty sexist. If you happen to have read the Bible, it's about as sexist a text as you can get. And all of everything that happens is, it's God and Jesus. This is all men, right? The structure of the family is centered with the head being the husband or the father, the father-son relation. That's what's important here. That the woman is the object of love, of the love of the man. She is the beloved, so she appears in Levinas's philosophy in this way, and that's a massive detriment to his philosophy, because he ends up sounding sexist. I mean, he ends up having written a book about philosophy that really only makes sense from the view of a man. It's the man who loves the woman, and the feminine is to be loved. She is the beloved only. The man has the son, and that's the relation of fecundity. It's the father to the son. So yeah, that whole aspect of religion, of his faith, ends up being just transplanted into his philosophy, to its detriment. But ironically enough, I have to give Levinas a bit of respect here, because he's not reinventing his faith. He's not reinventing his religion. He's not pretending that his religion is something that it isn't. He's not whitewashing his religion. The father is actually the father-mother. And the son, when we say the son, we really mean the daughter as well, the child as well. He's not kind of updating his religion to conform with our modern day sensibilities and norms and values. He's just throwing it out there the way it is, the way it originally was. You got to give the guy a bit of respect for that. But unfortunately, the problems that he pulls forward associated with this from his religion end up polluting his philosophy as well. And finally, I think the notions so he's redefining a lot of these terms, right? Resurrection is not resurrection, the way that Levinas is using it here, is not about an individual, the Son of God, being reborn or being resurrected on whatever third day or whatever. He's talking about time, instants of time being resurrected. He's not talking about, when he talks about the Virgin, he's not talking about the birth of the Son of God. He's talking about our relation with the feminine, in Eros and love. He's talking about the way that the woman is never completely graspable, and in that sense retains her virginity. These kinds of redefinitions, I think, obviously they weaken his philosophy, because he's importing religious terms. He's importing religion into philosophy, and religion has a completely different mandate, I guess you could say. Religion, ultimately, it's about faith, right? No matter how much argumentation you want to put into it, how much you want to try and derive logical arguments from it, it's ultimately about faith. If it wasn't about faith, we wouldn't need religion. So religion at its core is about believing in things that are, it's about believing in spite of the evidence, despite the available evidence. It has to be that way. And that's the virtue of faith, as far as I'm concerned. If it wasn't that way, there'd be no need for faith. We would just know it. It would just be true. It would be obvious. We would be able to work it out. The fact that we can't means that religion needs faith. And religion, then, if you import religious terms into your philosophy, you run the risk of turning your philosophy into a faith, of saying that what's important in my philosophy is that you just believe it, even though the evidence is all against it, even though it goes against logic, or even though we can't argue for this notion in any real way, you should still believe it. It imports that way of thinking, that religious way of thinking, a way of thinking centered on faith. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with faith, but I'm just saying it's different from philosophy. And to muddy your philosophical waters with faith, with notions that are centered in faith, I think does a detriment to your philosophy, and it does a detriment to Levinas here. But also, strangely enough, I think if I were religious, I would still have a problem with Levinas using these terms the way he does, because he is redefining them. Like I said before, the resurrection in Christianity or in Judaism, that's a serious thing, and it applies to a specific it applies to a specific situation. That's only happened once in history, and it was when Jesus came back from the dead. But Levinas is talking about it happening not just once, but not just many times, but every instant resurrection is taking place. He's just trivializing the notion, right? Same with the virgin, right? The virgin birth was a serious event, the birth of the Son of God. Levinas is talking about it in abstract metaphysical terms, related to concerning our relation with the beloved, our love, that relation with the feminine. But this is to trivialize the virgin. It's to trivialize the whole notion of virginity and what it means in Christianity or in Judaism. So I think even if I were religious, I would object to this merging of these two fields. So anyway, end rant, but I was thinking about this a lot last week, actually, while I was going through this chapter last week and the beginning of this week. So anyway, let me put that to the side, and let's move on to a summary. So we looked at in this video, we looked at subjectivity and Eros, and basically this was just tracking the path of the progression of subjectivity from separation, where it was an active power, to the feminine, to the relation with the feminine, where it became the passivity entered the equation, and we were encumbered by our existence, and then finally to fecundity, where that existence, that encumberment, was alleviated through transcendence. The second part was transcendence and fecundity, and here Levinas talked about the way transcendence fails in the philosophies of being and becoming, but it succeeds in Levinas because he takes the plurality and applies it to the event of being. He applies it to the individual, him or herself. And through that, he's able to secure a genuine transcendence for the subject. The third section, filiality and fraternity. So the idea that there is neither a rupture nor continuity with the paternal. Rather, what we have is the son takes up their existence, their past, as a recourse through the father. So just that capturing that ambiguity, the son is not something completely different, but not just a direct continuation of the father. And finally, we looked at the infinity of time. And the interesting thing here was the notion of pardon, which Levinas talks about as something paradoxical, the way that pardon kind of acts against the flow of time, the reversibility of time, taking a past moment and purifying it in the present. We also looked at the way that pardon had an important role in constituting time itself. And this notion of resurrection that is connected with the pardon, with that discontinuity, ultimately traces back to fecundity and has its ground in fecundity. And so that is, I think, all we need to do regarding section 4. The next video will look at the conclusions. My summary of that turned out to be much longer than I expected, but I'm still hoping to get through it in one video. And I've also, at the request of someone, decided to make a video for the preface as well. So just to really, I'm doing the preface right, will be the last video I make. So by the time someone will watch this and go right through to the end and then suddenly find, we're going back to the preface. But yeah, this is, I'm responding to someone's request for that. So 2 more videos left, conclusions, and then a shorter video I think it's going to be on the preface. But that's it for me today. Thanks everyone. I'll see you in the next video.